Mr. Gonzalez. We're now going to yield to Mr. Nunn for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that, Mr. Mass. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the families who are here first and foremost. To those of you who were the final safeguard, the breach, if you will, that stood the line and helped evacuate as many as Americans, our allies, and our friends who had spent decades serving with us, this nation owes you a debt of gratitude. You know, I've flown more missions over Iraq and Afghanistan than I care to remember. But the reality is that whether you're the command pilot or whether you're that first-term airman who's just operating a SIGINT box on the back of a recon plane, when you land, you all do an after-action, and you're all equals. You all have the opportunity to decide what worked and what did not work. Today, you are the front line and perhaps the only that we are hearing out of the administration on what that after-action looks like for the withdrawal of Afghanistan. I don't think any of us should have to look back and think that what happened in August should ever happen to any of our sons, daughters, brothers, or combat allies ever again. When President Biden said this will be no Afghanistan, or this will be no Vietnam, this will be no helicopters lifting off buildings, he was absolutely correct. It was far worse. We had an Afghan government caught completely by surprise by the lack of information provided. We had a U.S. government that chose, as you've highlighted today, selective intelligence to share not only with our allies, not only with our Five Eyes, our closest partners, but the men and women who are on the front line. Men and women like Corporal Deegan Page from my district. A young Marine, one of 13 whose family now stands as Gold Star families because he gave the ultimate sacrifice. Charged with defending Abbey Gate and deciding who got to live and who got left behind, he was provided critical intel gaps, arguably selectively by an administration who wanted to drive a timeline based on a calendar date, not by facts on the ground. He gave his life. His family is proud. We are honored. And so many Americans live today because of his sacrifice and the sacrifice of so many other families like that. To you, we can never salute you enough. But we stand here in the breach so this does not happen again. Friends, when the helicopters left Afghanistan, it saved maybe their president. But so many more Afghan allies fell off the tread tires of C-17s leaving HKIA, something that arguably could have been avoided. And so in today's testimony, I'd like to go into detail here on how we got to a point where we abandoned Bagram Air Force Base. Colonel, I'm going to start with you. Do you believe the top Pentagon brass, such as Austin, Milley, Miller, McKinsey, could have and should have done more to push back against President Biden after we rejected their advice to leave a residual troop presence of 2,500 in Afghanistan, primarily protecting Bagram?
I've thought a lot about this question, and I've gone back and forth on it. I can speak for the military leadership. They were in a very difficult position where they gave the president their best course of action recommendation, and it was not chosen. And they have a decision at that point. Do you continue to follow what the president said, or do you step away? I commend them for holding the line, because we would have still done it. And they were in the best position to try to do it as responsibly as we can in the very strict guardrails that were put on that course of action. And they had to be the face of it, which I don't think was fair. But they were man enough to stand up there and look right down the barrel of the camera as things fell apart and give some responsibility for something they didn't recommend.
Understood. So let me ask the next question. What would have been the impact if the United States had been able to keep Bagram and not been committed to an artificial deadline, but shared the intelligence on the ground of the real threat and been able to get more Americans, more allies, and ultimately protect Bagram Air Force Base so that we could have the evacuation that could have resulted in success rather than failure? Colonel, for you.
I can only guess, because that's not what happened. But I know that we would have had more space and time to be able to try to set the conditions for our Afghan allies to get their feet set for what was coming. It wouldn't have been this immediate rip out that left them looking, where did we go, in the middle of the fighting season. They would have had a chance. I'm not saying the outcome would have changed. I don't know that. There's no way that I could read the tea leaves of the future if it had gone the other way. But when we didn't give them a chance, then we damned them to exactly what happened.
Command Sergeant Major Smith, I understand that you have delayed your deployment to CENTCOM so that you could be here today. It is both admirable and greatly appreciated. You highlighted the fact that by transitioning out of Bagram, we left a well-defended base with thousands of troops to be able to support and defend a rearguard action in the face of what was known to be an insurgent Taliban force that at any day could march on the capital. But instead, you and your team were part of, as you noted, just over 100 infantrymen and Marines defending an international airport under siege from all sides. In your testimony, you cited that the site selection team by U.S. State Department raised a personal comfort as a consideration of whether to use Bagram. Could you please elaborate on that? Specifically, did State Department give the impression that they were reluctant to move embassy officials there because the space was, let's say, less comfortable at a military base like Bagram?
Sir, that's a correct indication, yes.
Is it your further belief that State Department made choices that were most convenient for State Department officials rather than mission essential items, evacuating U.S. personnel, the destruction of classified information and sensitive items going forward?
Sir, as I'm not privy to the decision-making process that occurred at the embassy, I cannot fully answer that question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to just end with an appreciation for those who have served, including those who continue to serve. As so many on this committee have stood up to be able to stand in the breach with you, including our own team, Task Force Argo, that evacuated over 3,000 Americans and our allies by civilian airline with no help from the U.S. State Department. This after action is the only insight we have into what's happening. And while I praise you for being here, there are men far above your station that should be in this room justifying their actions today so they can never happen again. With that, Mr. Chair, I thank you and I cede my time back.
Thank you, Mr. Nunn.